Okay, I just sent the YouTube live link.
Okay, let me mute you. Yeah, it's
Okay.
like,
Who's in the
let me
live?
log out from here.
Okay.
Testing. Testing. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? I'm testing it, right? Listen.
Yeah.
Can you guys hear me?
Okay, Claudia is typing.
Can you guys hear me? Can you hear me? Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing, testing, testing. Can you guys hear me? Can you guys hear me?
Okay, Yalitza said yes. Claudia, can you speak and let's see if Yalitza can hear you? Oh, say pizza.
Pizza.
Okay, I don't know if you can hear me through this. Okay,
We can hear you. That's what we wanted, right?
Yeah.
pizza. Hi, hi, Yolitza, can you hear me?
Wait, Yalitza, can you hear Claudia? Or us or both? Oh, okay, cool. Awesome. Okay, so the audio is working on all fronts. Thank you guys so much for helping us test out.
I think the YouTube is delayed.
Oh, is there a delay? Like when we talk, when you. Hello.
Hi,
Hello.
welcome.
Oh, yes. Good. So there's a delay.
That's okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's fine.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is the special meeting of the Plan, Governance and Administrative Issues Committee of the Board of Deferred Compensation Administration. Today is July 29th, 26th. Let the record reflect that committee members Matthew Benham and Todd Lee are present and a quorum of the committee is established. Committee Chair Matthew Benham will be presiding over this meeting. For the record, I am Deferred Compensation Plan Manager Esther Chang, also present as Legal Counsel Charles Hong.
Okay, this is Chair Matthew Benham. I'll call the meeting to order. It's now 12:05 p.m. First thing on our agenda after that is public comment. If there's any public comment, we can hear that now.
Any person wishing to make a public comment, press *9 to request to speak and press *6 to unmute and speak when prompted. No public comments at this time.
Okay, in that case, let's move on to the next agenda item, which is number 3, Committee Report 26-01, Secure 2.0 Provisions, Section 311, 314, and 326.
Good afternoon. My name is Stephen Montagna, and I will be presenting this report. So in this report, we're addressing some potential modifications to the plan document concerning really just 2 provisions that were impacted by the Secure 2.0 Act. We're going to start with Section 311, which is the birth or adoption provision. So this provision actually had its origins with the original Secure Act of 2019. And it allows a participant to make a withdrawal of up to $5,000 for birth or adoption of a child. There are certain limitations, such as for adoptions being limited to those under age 18, not applying to adoption of a spouse's child. That's the original provision. Distributions of any pre-tax amounts are treated as taxable income. Of course, for our plan, there are no early distribution penalties because this is a 457 plan. Plan sponsors can allow participants to recontribute the withdrawn amounts, and those recontributions are treated like an eligible rollover. So let's say you took out $5,000, it was pre-tax, you want to put it back in, it's treated as a rollover into the plan and then recharacterized as pre-tax as it was originally withdrawn. So this provision was adopted into our plan document, so it's there now. But previously, under the 2019 law, recontributions could take place at any time. This was vague, and it led to some administrative challenges for record keepers, and also some potential tax issues for participants if they waited a long time to recontribute the funds. Under Secure 2.0, there was a 3-year recontribution window limitation that was put into place that also applied to some of the other special withdrawal provisions for which recontributions were you could also recontribute the withdrawn amounts. So what we're proposing here that the committee recommends the board is basically just a minor clarification within the plan document that this would be subject to the 3-year recontribution window. That's really how it's being administered currently, right? So there's nothing we're doing that's inconsistent with the law. It's just this is really more like a technical cleanup of that document. Are there any questions on this one?
No.
Okay. So the next is Section 314, which is the provision for domestic abuse withdrawals. This is a wholly new provision that was enacted under Secure 2.0, and it's available to anyone who is a victim of domestic abuse. That term is actually defined very broadly, so it can include not only physical abuse, but also psychological, emotional, economic abuse. Participants can withdraw up to $10,000 or 50% of the participant's account balance, whichever is less, and they also can recontribute the withdrawn amounts. So This is not within the plan document currently, and so we are recommending to you that you recommend to the board that this provision be added to allow this additional flexibility for participants. Any questions on this one?
I do have a few, I don't know. Okay. So to me, as a former criminal prosecutor, this issue is really important, and I think it's something that we need to make sure we get right and think really carefully about how to provide this, because we're not talking about a happy event like an adoption or a qualified birth. We're talking about a really bad situation, and we're talking about probably in most situations the woman who's having the finances of the family control in a abusive situation and needs this money to facilitate leaving that situation or that kind of environment. And so there's a couple of things in here that that I think we need to think about. And for one is the issue of the recontributions. Under the current language, is the idea that the recontribution of the money is required over the 3 years, or that it's not required? What is the staff recommendation on it?
No, the recontributions are optional to the participant. So there's a requirement for this provision or any of the other provisions that they can recontribute.
And how would the person actually get the money that they're withdrawing from this plan?
So there is a form that they would submit to the plan administrator. So now this provision does not have any kind of documentation requirements. And in fact, because of the broadness of the language within the law, it appears that the congressional intent was that, you know, that would not be that would not necessarily be something that was expected, that individuals would have to provide documentation. Because you can imagine, for example, you know, if someone's experiencing some kind of emotional abuse or economic abuse, or even physical abuse, right? You're almost saying, well, you need to go, you know, get some kind of police report or something. So it doesn't seem very realistic to build that in, and it appears that this was what Congress was going in this anyway.
Right. Is the 10,000? I see it's a maximum. Is it a maximum per claim, or is that a lifetime maximum?
I don't believe it's a lifetime maximum. I think it would be per incident. My recollection is correct.
Okay, and what about the way that the withdrawals happen? Is it one withdrawal up to 10,000, or could you take 2,000 this time, 4,000 another time to reach that?
I don't know. I don't know if was that a question to Boya or?
We have that. I think Alex is on the line. Alex, would you have a response to that question? Okay, we'll wait to see if he can chat the answer to Lilith. We're having audio issues, but those are the things that we would then next work with Boya to determine in terms of the actual detail of the implementation of it. But based on the other provisions we have at hand, I think we would just need to go back and take a look at the form. So what would happen is after we get the okay on the provision, we would go back to Boya and work on the mechanics of it. So and then in terms of any of that language, we can cut back and provide that to the community. And then if we need to, we'll always make sure that the form itself will indicate to the in-person whether it's an annual or, you know, an aggregated amount that's going to be available to them. aside from that, in the case that it is restricted, whether to 10,000 or a portion of it, we would also help the participant because there's going to be other avenues in which they can get distributions as well. So, for instance, the next item is going to be an unforeseen emergency withdrawal. So there would be additional avenues in the case that it would be restricted. But we'll try to confirm that now with our administrator on the side, and then we'll update us the meeting as well.
Because for us, we have sort of a dual role because this account is not meant to be checking, right? It's not meant to be easily withdrawn and put back in. So it requires a special circumstance like this, or like a fire emergency or other situations. And I don't think there should be some sort of standard of proof for getting these out, but at the same time, probably shouldn't be an unlimited number of withdrawals that are never limited in any way. So I'd be interested in looking at something where we might impose whether we can impose some sort of lifetime max, but allow multiple withdrawals to get to that. And the option for recontribution, but not, I think it's unrealistic to think that most people will be able to recontribute that money if they're in that domestic violence situation. So is that something that is feasible to create essentially a way that this doesn't just become open to abuse by people who just want to take their money out?
Well, just to add some Charles Hong, Plan Council, in terms of the domestic issue withdrawal situation, because it's unpredictable as to the frequency of them, there is no clear guidance as to if it's like a lifetime or so forth. So it's rightly so. It's based on incident,
Right.
you know.
And I think probably what we could do, and we'll do some more work to research this, is we would probably want to be consistent with administrative practices that are being used more broadly. I think this is one of the newer provisions that might not, there's probably some information out there that we haven't tapped yet about not just exactly how this works from the perspective of our administrator, but then also how that's being applied with other plans, and we probably want to be consistent with that.
Okay. Is it also possible when people come in to ask for this that our staff can provide references to domestic violence counseling or other things in our office so that we can be a resource to victims?
Yeah, we can talk with Employee Benefits Division and see what other resources are available. There could be additional things that are available through the EAP program that we could refer them to. So we can certainly put together, a guide if we are made aware of that situation.
Okay, yeah, I just think if we're going to be a contact point for domestic violence victims, then we should have a full scope of the things that the city can offer to them available, or at least have ourselves ready for that.
Yeah, I think there are some resources, for example, for hardship withdrawals that are built in, like those reference points are there. We have to go back and take a look at that with benefits. I believe that they're there, and then we would just carry those over to this.
I think very good questions. I would move the staff recommendations along with the request for staff to provide answers to the chair's questions in the forthcoming work.
I would second that. All in favor, say aye. The ayes have it.
Okay, thank you. Yes, we'll incorporate those details into the board report as we bring it back for the plan document discussion. Thank you.
Okay, anything else on that item?
Otherwise, just for your information, I just did want to note the attachment to the report. We did just provide a summary for the committee, and we'll also attach it to the board report as well, just of the provisions we've reviewed so far related to the Secure 2.0 provisions. And kind of address now, after this, I think we have now addressed most of the provisions related to distributions that are optional. And we'll continue to review to see if there are additional provisions that we'll need to have. But otherwise, we're going to be now pivoting to focus on the plan document amendments that will need to be made to ensure that all of these provisions are accounted for and are addressed. So any plan document language will need to be made by the end of 2027. So we'll try to get ahead of that, of course, but just to note.
The latest plan document is dated 2021, is that right? Right. Reference.
Actually, there is an updated version, so we'll have staff send you an updated copy that
The one I saw online was dated
is
2021.
okay. We'll double check the linkages and make sure that those are up to the right ones. Thank you.
Okay, the next item on the agenda, number 4, committee report 26-02. Review temporarily adopted section 312, self-certification of unforeseeable emergency withdrawals.
Thank you. I'm Sarah Julius, Senior Management Analyst, BCP. Report 2602. Review of temporarily adopted section 312, self-certification. So this report discusses Secure 2.0 emergency provision section 312 related to hardship and unforeseen emergency withdrawals, which will be referred to as UEWs. Before getting into the report, since we are going to be talking a lot about UEWs, I think it's important to clearly lay out what they are. So in this context, UEWs refer to withdrawals from DCP accounts that participants are allowed to make when they're faced with an immediate financial need. And the need basically has to be because of unforeseen circumstances beyond your control. Some allowable UEW scenarios that are actually outlined in our plan document include imminent foreclosures or eviction, medical expenses, funeral expenses, and, for example, needing to rebuild a home as a result of a natural disaster. So UEWs would not be for like purchasing a house or college tuition, for example. So, but even if your situation is eligible, taking UEW should essentially be a last resort. I think on our UEW application form, it actually says that participants must take any available loans before requesting UEW. So the use case is that you have no other means to pay for this emergency. And the process of requesting a UEW would basically involve a participant submitting a request to the DCP. There's a form which has to specify the reason for the request, essentially like what are the unforeseen circumstances, specify the amount, and they also have to provide supporting documentation. So that paperwork goes to the administrator, FOIA, and they decide whether the situation qualifies, and they determine whether the participant gets the money or not. I guess as a side note, if the participant disagrees with the decision that FOIA makes, they can make an appeal to the board for further review, but obviously that's a whole process. So another aspect of UEWs is that they are not eligible for payment. Once the money is distributed, there isn't a mechanism in place to repay or to compensate that amount, unlike some of the provisions in CPs discussed. So taking UEWs at all should be a last resort. And there is an element of finality to it in terms of potential long-term impacts on a participant's account. So hopefully that provides a clear picture of what UEWs are and what they are not. And now let's have the report. So the whole UEW framework that I just described existed before Secure 2.0. The new element that section 312 introduces doesn't change anything about what UEWs are, but rather involves a new option to administer UEWs. So section 312 enables participants to take emergency withdrawals through self-certification. Basically, participants themselves can make the determination of whether their situation qualifies as an eligible VW scenario, how much money they need from their DCP account to address the emergency, and they don't need to submit any substantiating documentation for their situation. They are expected to retain any required document in case they would be audited sometime in the future, but yeah, they don't need it to request. So as discussed in the report, the board had temporarily approved self-certifications for VWs due to the wildfires in LA back in January of last year, which was declared a major federal nature disaster. During this time, the board also temporarily approved other emergency provisions, which included section 115, which allowed for emergency personal expense distributions up to $1,000 per calendar year, and section 331, which allowed for disaster recovery distribution up to $22,000 and loans up to $100,000 for federally declared disasters. Those two provisions were later permanently adopted by the board in August of 2025. Then to consider whether this third provision, section 312, could also be permanently adopted or review as needed. Report and analysis. So as we mentioned, the board temporarily approved self-certification VWs, and so I reviewed data not only from the self-certification period, but also historical data to compare trends. If you want to look at the table on page 3, since self-certification was made available in May 2025, 398 participants utilized this method, withdrawing a total of 6.8 million in 2025. And of those 398 participants, 271 made a single withdrawal, 127 took multiple withdrawals. The participants on average took 1.6 withdrawals. The average withdrawal amount was 4,700, and the average withdrawal total amount per participant was 8,800. And if you want to look at the graph on page 4, so based on the results, the participants didn't go crazy with self-certification. If you look at the graph, so the blue bars they show the total dollar amount withdrawn per quarter, and the red line shows how many participants made those withdrawals. So there's an initial uptick in UEWs when self-certification was first introduced in Q2 of 2025, which is to be expected because self-certification was implemented for our plan in response to a large community need. And then you see the usage trends downward in both respects, so towards more historically comparable amounts. So the average participant is using UEWs basically the same as it's always been used in the past. And for full context on these numbers, it is worth noting that statistical outliers were excluded from the data in terms of withdrawal amounts, which is indicated on the data as presented. This is done so less typical cases wouldn't disproportionately affect the overall data. And in terms of outliers, 40 statistical outliers were identified, all of which came from the highest withdrawal amounts. And if you'd like to see the same graph showing raw data, you can see that in attachment B with the addition of Q1 2026 raw data. And it shows a similar trend downward or level out. To provide a recommendation, staff outlined 2 potential ways of moving forward with self-certification. Option 1 is to continue to allow self-certification as it's currently being used. Participants can request UEWs as needed without hindrance or review or approval. And if we went that route, staff would regularly review UEW use data. If any issues arise. And then option 2 would be a recommendation for the permanent adoption of self-certification for emergency withdrawals with the addition of some guidelines. So that would be that the number of withdrawal requests wouldn't be limited for the participants. And it would implement an annual cap of $20,000. And to be clear, the $20,000 annual cap would only be for the self-certification process. If a participant was experiencing a qualifying emergency that required more than $20,000, they would still be able to make a request using the approval process that the plan is using to increase the past.
So in option 1, there's no cap, right?
Right.
And for the secure 2.0 standard, there was no cap there either, and it was the self-certification process.
Right.
So now we could have both. We could have a self-certified amount and plus a reviewed amount as well, potentially without a cap.
Right. So like the total cap is essentially just based on whatever is feasible, whatever's reasonable for that emergency. But no dollar.
Yeah, if I can just add, technically, so in terms of the request, though, you're only allowed to request the amount that's necessary for the emergency before you have to provide documentation that the amount was specific and documented, whereas now it's more so that it's self-certification. So in that sense, so there's a cap, but there technically is a cap they should be certified to if you think of it in that perspective.
The existing process of self-certification, the period that we have seen this, where there were some outliers, like you said, do you have a sense as to how large some of the bigger amounts might have been?
Yeah, overall, we identified 40 outliers. They were all on the upper end of the withdrawal amounts. They were not on the lower end. And yeah, for example, some of the highest withdrawals were 300,000, 200,000, 180,000. Those were each one single withdrawal per different participant.
Do you by chance know the reasons whether it's fire related, or?
It was, the reason cited was for home repair. After that, 154,000 twice for that participant, and the reason cited was eviction. 150,000 for another participant, eviction. 150,000 for home repair, extraordinary circumstances.
And there's no repayment requirement for this, right?
Right.
And but you're recommending here $20,000 cap is one of the options. Can you just talk a little bit about the reason for 20,000?
So the rationale for adding the annual limit is to consider limiting excessive non-retirement distributions and to provide protection against potentially unintended impacts, like taking a large withdrawal, reduce like the total account growth accumulation long term. So that rationale relies on an assumption that the fundamental purpose of the DCP is to be a retirement plan, and that can be discussed. But yeah, so for the figure of 20,000 was used based on the data, the actual self-certification use. So the refined.
Sorry, I thought that the average withdrawal was 8,800.
Yeah, so the refined median and average total amount requested per participant did not exceed $10,000. And since the data spanned less than a full year, that amount was doubled to ensure that there is a sort of buffer there. And our goal is to determine the typical amount that participants use, not skewed by name pairs. And the other aspect of that recommendation is to not limit the number of UEWs that participants could request during the year. Looking at the data that participants withdrew, the highest number of distribution requested relatively low amounts each time.
I saw that in there. Is that shown in the data that you presented anywhere? I saw those words, but I didn't see where you got that. I don't know if you put that in.
No, it's not seen. It's not seen in like a 3-year.
Okay, can you describe that then?
I know many of the reasons cited were for to avoid eviction, and that pattern of use essentially is consistent with the purpose of the emergency withdrawals, to withdraw only as much as is necessary to cover that financial emergent need.
Right, but do you have some analysis that led you to write that? Something like people who had X number of distributions had an average distribution dollar amount of this versus people who only took one have an average of this, something like that. What's that?
Not broken down in those terms, but I'll tell you. So one participant, for example, who withdrew, or two participants who withdrew the highest number of withdrawals, which was 10 per participant. And the sum of like the total that they withdrew was $6,600 and $3,000 respectively. So each of those was to mostly avoid eviction and also for Netflix. And the rest of the results were similar to that. The next highest was 8. Three participants withdrew 8 times, and the total was 16,000 for one, 7,000 for another, 2,000 for another, 23,000 for another. So they, made withdrawals up to 8 or 10 times, and the grand total was around, the average. Did that answer the question?
Yeah. So yeah, I thought that was good question. Under option 2, if someone self-certified for that they needed $20,000 and they took that, when is the next time that they could do that again?
I'm gonna do it the calendar year.
Oh, so 20,000 is a calendar max.
Mhm.
So they could do it on December 31st, and then they can do it on January 2nd.
I mean, historically, it hasn't been limited. I think the same.
And we still have, there's a third option, right, which is to go back, not to do this, and to go back to how we did it, how it was before the fires, and just decide that if we have another federally named disaster, we could do another temporary rate. We could do it that way, right?
The options that were presented here to approve section 312, but your point, we could not approve it and go back to how it was before.
So I'll tell you, my, I guess, the way that I think about this plan is that it is primarily a retirement plan. And similarly to the pension, you can't tap it all the time. I represented the Lacers members at the last meeting. We learned that the median balance for Lacers members is $40,000. And the median balance for DWP members is $30,000. So my concern with this is not that these emergencies aren't real, or that these things don't exist, or that the needs aren't there. It's that it gives an option to basically completely divest out after people have managed to build something for their retirement. And I think many people aren't saving enough, and they're going to find that their tier 3 pensions are not sufficient in retirement. And I take this very differently than the DV situation, but having lots of unexamined trapdoors out that allow the average member to just completely pull out at any time, I think is not in the interest of people that voted for me. And there's a like sort of a nanny state element of this, which is it's in their best interest, even if in the moment they don't want that best interest, they want to take the money out in their long-term best interest. And part of our job as the board is to facilitate and protect that long-term best interest. So I'm not sure that I agree with the logic that because in a federally declared disaster, people took 8,000 over 6 months, means that for all time, they should have a $20,000 option in perpetuity when there's no disaster. And especially when the median balances are so low, and that it would bring them basically almost down to zero for many members. I also think that these large amounts that came out that were not included are probably not supported if they had to be proven. I mean, two $154,000 withdrawals on the basis of eviction. We can't think that this is 100% legitimate, even though most of them probably were. And so my bias on this is to put more control on this and to retain the option as the board to do what we did last time and create a window of time when people can access the money more easily in response to real documented disaster that everybody knows about, rather than leave this exit door at any time for the median member to basically be out of the plan entirely over a period of 2 months.
Yeah, so if there was another federally declared emergency, they do have a section 331 option to go that route, but you're saying like outside of that. I think it essentially comes down to a philosophical view of whether we feel that if the board feels that the plan essentially functions fundamentally as a retirement plan, or whether it's participants' money and they should have access to it. So for us, option 2 was kind of meeting in the middle somewhere, allowing participants to be able to access their funds if they needed them. I mean, personally, I would say even if the process doesn't take a long time, if you're experiencing a serious emergency, then you have to fill out a form and provide all this documentation and estimate the amount that it's going to be. That feels cumbersome if you have a lot going on at the time, and it would be easier to have access to that money sooner.
To your point, I think there's a good point that we look at an option where we extend sort of piloting this, or as you will, and provide a new review period, maybe with a cap on it. To your point, 20,000 was sort of projected, but maybe a $10,000 cap would be something that we can take a look at over a year period of time and see what people's habits are relative to that. Provides that control as well in terms of how much should access to.
You're saying we propose a $10,000 cap. Can we do it as rather than calendar year as a 12-month rolling so that there's not this opportunity for December and January?
Okay, yeah, so that also enters into some other areas of consideration. For example, It's in attachment C. Voya has provided, their report based on the system functionality and whether the current system will be able to implement putting in an annual cap, for example. And that's currently not feasible. The estimate would be that it would be available in June 2027. Yeah, June 2027. So that is consideration that we wouldn't necessarily be able to implement 20,000 or 10,000, whatever the number might be immediately in the system, whether it's a calendar year or a rolling 12.
Do we have a lawyer person here?
You're making all good points.
Can you state your name for the record?
Jose Morales, I'm the Strategic Relationship Manager for Wi-Fi Financial. So all good points. State of Virginia, they have a limit. They impose a cap, as we're just alluding to right now, $2,500 once every 2 years. So there's, I think, three options. One to consider. One would be to, the intent originally was to provide this for a 6-month period and then stop after the, because this was in response to an emergency, federal emergency.
That's the reason that our plan is considered to
Go from,
temporarily enable it, but I mean, other plans have also enabled it at times. We could have enabled it sooner than that.
right. And then, or set an overall cap, as we were talking about as well, is that, and determine what that cap would be in a reasonable amount. Or go back to the old way, which would be to not have have everything reviewed. But I think there is some benefit to having an option of allowing some, individuals to take withdrawal, but again, just putting guardrails around that.
Well, what about the 12-month thing? Because under section 115, there are penalty-free withdrawals of up to 1,000 per calendar year. So in order to enforce that, don't you have to be able to do calendar year limits?
Yeah, so there would be calendar, $1,000 provision, there would be a calendar year limit.
Okay, so we could do something like that for these withdrawals too, right?
Yeah, yes,
So could we do a 12-month rolling rather than a calendar year? You have the ability to do that?
that would be something we'd have to design and program.
Right.
But that could be a consideration.
In that scenario, are we only talking about if a participant requested under $20,000 in a single transaction? It wouldn't be able to necessarily add up if they have more than one.
I think that's something to be determined. So how you want to implement that.
Okay, and what is Virginia a client of what?
Yes.
Do they have, you have to take it all at one time, or can they take portions of it, You may not know, I'm sorry. That's not another question.
Only one hardship process per 24-month period. Is there a limit on their form?
So if they're gonna take it, they should take all of it at one time.
That's according to Virginia's plan, yeah.
With a cap of $2,500.
Of course, but that's much more restrictive than what we're talking about.
Okay.
And it's also worth noting, another plan, New York State DCP, they limit to a maximum of 2 per calendar year, and they also have a cap. So their cap is 20,000 per request. And if they were to make that 2 requests per year, it's $4,000.
Okay, so then is that a client of what as well?
No, they're not. No. But again, just another way to implement the same.
Right, but that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, so that it would be able to know that you had previously taken a certain amount and then add it to your new request and know whether it's under the limit.
The way that the other plans are set up, it seems like it would be less difficult to implement it, just because they limit it to two requests. You're either over the limit on the first one or you have the second.
Is our, under the previous, before the changes for the fire, these requests had to be vetted by FOIA?
Mhm.
And was there a dollar limit, calendar limit? No, so whatever you,
Just whatever is
whatever
for them.
FOIA agreed was needed was the amount.
They'd have to
Was it-
provide the appropriate documentation to support.
So if they asked for $15,000 and then they provided documents, but those documents only showed a need of less, then FOIA would authorize less.
And it had to fall within the reason for the emergency as well. So there are some prescribed reasons, prior that would allow such, and then you accept the documentation FOIA would review. In the sense of self-certification should be the same process, except that the responsibility now is on the participant versus on FOIA to review the documentation.
Right, and the reason is just to spell them out, is one of them would be like unreimbursed medical expenses. And they would have to provide the reasoning should get audited to the IRS for that. Repair of principal residence, there would be prevention of mortgage, foreclosure or eviction from principal residence. Funeral expenses, and that could be for child, parent, dependent, or beneficiary. And last was, could be loss of income either for the participant or their spouse or dependent. And again, documentation would eventually would be necessary either to FOIA if we took that responsibility back, or to the IRS should they get audited.
Are those bases that you just listed ones that the plan that we established as what you shall test for, or are those FOIA policy?
These are the IRS.
Those are IRS policy. Okay, so those are the reasons under the prior that are allowed. And the self-certification would be someone certifying that they fall within one of those reasons.
Yeah,
Correct.
on the form, they will check off the reasoning and they will also attest to, I have the appropriate documentation needed for the reason and for the amount that I'm requesting. So in terms of the forms themselves, there is a notice on the participant or an expectation that they are aware of all of these things that are involved.
And then some of these other plans, documents, request forms, I've seen, a list of the qualifying UEW reasons, and then also specifying per reason, like what required documentation would be needed for that.
For example, a mortgage, in case of a mortgage, they would have to provide like a tax lien, a bank or mortgage statement or letter from a bank. So there is a listing that IRS provides the guidelines for that.
Part of the conversation, why I wanted to sort of level set about what UEWs are in the beginning, is that if you are requesting one, it is expected to be a lapse, or that there's no other way you have to pay for this emergency. And that implies, a sense of urgency that they would need the funds quickly. So that's also a consideration.
Is that something that FOIA was checking in your process to make sure that it was the only source available of money to meet the need?
In the prior process, of course, they would have to provide the documentation and exhaust. I think maybe I have to go back, but I think they have to exhaust the loan provision first before dipping into UEW.
I don't know about you. I'm much more comfortable with the prior system with FOIA, which had no limit. It had no limit. As long as that limit, that need was shown. And then in a fire situation where suddenly we had thousands of needs all at the same time, we said, okay, we're going to take a temporary and we're not going to check. And now the question is, do we go back to the system where you can get as much out as you need, as long as you just show us that it's what you need? Versus we're going to create basically a $20,000 draw available at all times to everybody. To me, the prior system handles both concerns. It handles the fraud concern, but it also handles the people for whom the 20,000 is not enough. Right, because they can establish to FOIA that they need 30,000, that they need whatever they need, and then they can get it. But people who just want to use this as an opportunity to get out of the plan, including entirely, are stopped because they have to show something to FOIA. So I'm much more comfortable with the old plan, frankly.
Let's,
The old plan and the new plan are like option two includes the old plan. And with the option of participants being able to access up to $20,000 in a timely manner.
let's talk about, emergency situation, let's say, or let's say we revert back, we don't have the unrestricted or self-certification process, we go back to the way it had been passed. And there's, say, an earthquake that happens, devastating.
Emergency.
Yeah, and so presumably it'll be a federal emergency, right? Presumably. Is there, and I don't know anything about this, but are there potentially delays in the declaration? Are there, kind of thinking through in such a situation, are there going to be barriers to people in a real emergency situation, to get access to their funds if we make them go through this extra step, or if there is any sort of delay in the process relative to being able to get money through a federal emergency declaration? In other words, are we able to be nimble enough to be able to satisfy an emergency situation like what happened with fire?
And then also if it would be a federally declared emergency, they would also have access to section 331, which the board did permanently adopt the 22,000 in distributions for loans up to 100,000.
And I guess in terms of an emergency declaration, so the language is that it has to be federally declared. So in a disaster situation that might occur locally, there could arguably be a delay for that to happen at that level, whereas local one might take, it just would come a little bit faster. But in that situation, if we were to go back to the old way, then while they're waiting for that declaration to be official, then arguably there is a little bit of a barrier for them because now they have to submit that documentation. In that instance, also, we could kind of did what we did last time, where we bring it back to the board and for a temporary period of time, open up these provisions. So, but it would require a proactive action on part of the board. So,
I will say is not unprecedented because, for example, Puerto Rico, when they experienced the, a few years, 10 years ago now, the Santa Maria came through and the state responded very quickly, and those that had retirement plans were allowed to take funds from that. So there was some flexibility.
Well, for example, in the case of the fires, we passed that at our January meeting.
So if I may, so for the consideration of this provision, we really just wanted to bring it back to the committee and the board to consider, because anytime these regulations do come up in the IRS level, so they provide the boundary, and then we can determine whether or not we want to keep that boundary or restrict it a little further. So in this instance, as also mentioned in the memo as well, in terms of setting any cap or an aggregate or a total consideration amount, it will still take time for BOIA to implement that. So right now, the projection is implementation as of next year. Is that correct?
Yeah, the
That's the earliest that we can do.
Yeah, the implementation would be in June of 2027 to implement
So-
a tiered approach.
Yeah, so practically speaking, if we wish to set some kind of cap or an aggregate limit, then that would mean if the committee wished to implement something immediately, that would mean some manual work on the part of us trying to figure out how to make that happen before we can automate that process. So in lieu of that, potentially we could, at the end of the day, I would still recommend that we keep the self-certification optionally to provide an option for our participants, but explore further with BOIA what kind of caps we can what kind of guardrails we can implement for our participants. I can tell you anecdotally, sometimes even for the folks that have eviction or like mortgage foreclosure issues, sometimes they'll get elevated to us if they're unable to resolve the documentation matter with FOIA. But by the time they get to us, I've had maybe 1 or 2 instances where it's unfortunately too late for them. So I know that looking at 1 or 2 cases versus the whole of it is also a consideration as well. But I think it would be beneficial to those individuals to have to be able to do that. More immediately, I think what we can do is, so far we really only have about 3/4 worth of data on terms of the usage. And at least 2 of those quarters, I think, would be impacted by disaster related activity. So perhaps while we are talking to Voya, we continue with the self-certification and just kind of will come back to the committee with additional behaviors of how this is operating under the plan. So just a proposal or a consideration because of the fact that we do also need to consider how we would implement such a thing in the time, in the time frame that has been.
I'd be comfortable with that. I mean, so basically you're saying kind of keep it as it is, determine the technical capabilities and the timeline for being able to make changes potentially that.
And then, and see if our 20,000 cap, like we could kind of test it against that fuller amount of data and see if we had implemented that $20,000 cap, how many of our folks would have been impacted negatively by that. So we can continue to monitor, right? So because I agree with you, the large number of transactions and the multiple transactions, those are kind of 2 circumstances I think does warrant, for us to just kind of take a look at. But I mean, the bottom line for the provision is that not necessarily that we will constantly monitor, but if the plan becomes aware of information contrary, right, to the situation that's being represented, then arguably there is, reason for us to act. But I think it would be prudent just to kind of look at this issue further. Stephen, I will just bring you up. So, he was here when, say, loans were first introduced as well. And he was kind of sharing with me that for the loan withdrawal provisions, there is also, I'm part of administrators, and I think fair to kind of have concern over, are we going to let them have too much access to the account? And so, however, loans and UEWs are different, right? Loans you can pay back, UEWs you cannot. So I understand the concern. And so one of the reasons too, we brought this to consider whether or not to place these guardrails. So I think, within the time frame, we can explore further with Voya the operational, how this will work, what we can do, whether the calendar year total or the aggregate total, how much that could be. And then we also have to work out beyond that, how would be then the process for requiring documentation of those folks, because at that point there would be exception cases. Second, I think also would be prudent to wait a little bit more so we can get more data from comparative plans. To my knowledge, not too many have implemented, right? We are aware of these couple plans that have, but from my knowledge, not all plans have accepted it yet. So for instance, like County of Los Angeles hasn't done so either. So I'd be curious to see if that's just they're also kind of waiting to see, or if there are specific reasons for that. So just wanted to provide my 2 cents.
Were there, in the language that we added to respond to the fires, is that by its own terms, was it temporary? So it will expire, that ability to self-certify, will that expire at some point, or can that go on in perpetuity without further board action?
So right now it's provisionally adopted. So we would need an action by the board to say, let's adopt this provision, continue the provisional acceptance, and direct staff to come back with additional staff and Voya to come back with additional data and implementation details.
Okay, but if we didn't do either, it will continue to be provisionally adopted.
Arguably.
How long do you think we would need in order to collect the additional information and come back for further discussion?
I suppose it depends on how much data we want to be looking at. We could then at least go back and pull up a year's worth of data now that we are out, because right now we provided 3/4 worth. And then in terms of the implementation question, I guess, Jose, I'm not sure if you could speak to when you would think we would have additional answers. I mean, is the June 2027 date fixed in terms of potential implementation?
We're looking at June 2027. We would have to also make clear some of the things that we're talking about now, what levels we're talking about, whether it's a calendar year or rolling year. So those things will need to still be identified prior to that. There's also an administrative aspect too. And there's a technical aspect of how we put this together. And so it's automated. But for example, with the state of New York, there is a limit. But if the request goes beyond the limit, there is a committee in place that reviews anything could be contested. So there's also an administrative aspect to this as well that should be considered, I think, is for those amounts that are going to be beyond just the self-certification.
And there would also be the possibility of not only just reviewing the data in terms of, how to use it, what recommendations we might have, but also in terms of, long-term usage. So we could identify examples like you gave, Matthew, if somebody was consistently, taking a withdrawal in December and January.
Why would somebody need to take a UEW versus a loan, given how quickly the loan can be actually dispersed, which is fast? It's larger than 2 years of UEWs. It has no tax consequences. And in fact, they pay themselves interest rather than harming their long-term retirement. What is the circumstance when that wouldn't be sufficient?
Well, so for the DCP, like our self-certification application right now for UEWs, it does say that participants must take any available loans to them before requesting the UEW. So they're essentially certifying that there's not another option.
So if they have a zero loan balance, they will be denied an UEW?
I think they will be asked at least to certify that that's not right, that even taking a loan would cause some harm. Because what happens when you take out a loan is that there's a bi-weekly payment that is set, and that will automatically be deducted from their paycheck. So it could potentially set them up for additional financial risk exposure. Additionally, a lot of so say for instance these folks that are taking multiple withdrawals, the loan situation would have maybe covered them for maybe first one or two, or they might have already had a loan balance. We only allow up to 2 loans, regardless of the amount, and then for a maximum of 50,000 of your account or 50% of your account. So I think it would be a combination where they're either certifying that that's going to cause me more financial harm, or they've already exhausted this.
Mr. Bowie, would you like to hear back about this at the committee level again, or?
I think so. It sounds like also, we can't make a change per se effective immediately.
Unless we wanted to revert
Unless we
completely.
just stop it. Right at this time. So it might be beneficial to gather some more information, or going back to the report.
Okay. In that case, I have a motion that we not adopt the staff recommendation. We ask them to collect additional information and present it back to the committee at our next meeting, or whatever the right interval is. Maybe not the next one, but the one after that, and then
We will schedule a special meeting we are already in July, I'm sorry. So we'll look to scheduling another meeting before the end of the year with the committee. I would assume that would be the desired cadence.
So
is there a second for that motion?
Yes, I'm sorry. Are you not voting on the receiving and filing?
Yes.
So you're not going to vote on the receive and file, the report that they just gave?
Oh, there's separate. Yeah.
I think it might get updated between now and then. Do we need to receive and file it?
I think we should receive and file and then modify a recommendation B if that is workable, Charles.
The motion could be to receive and file, and then instruct staff to report back on the additional questions you've raised.
Okay.
Yeah.
Recommendations.
Yeah, as in, with respect to the subdivision or subpart.
Okay, so my amended motion therefore is to receive and file staff's report. We will not make a recommendation to the full board. And we'll ask staff to come back with additional information as it becomes available. Relevant to what was discussed here. Agreed. And I have,
They're both, I'm sorry.
oh, all in favor, say aye. Aye.
So, for the next time we report back on this topic, to the committee, are there specific elements or pieces of data that you would like to see from us?
Implementation timeline or procedural and technical or operational aspects of it. Respect, I think, in terms of caps on borrowing or caps on distributions. Yeah, and also time basis out there versus well. One of those areas, and then the additional financial information that's being tracked and documents. So it sounds like we're trying to get a year's worth to establish a little bit better as to what the patterns are there. And if staff has any updated recommendations for you.
Also, anything that we can learn about other plans elsewhere, other large DC plans. I feel no need to have Los Angeles be the cutting edge vanguard of implementing this. I'm happy to wait and see how it works in other places. So as you get other information about that, maybe Voya can help with looking through their clients and what other cities are doing or other municipalities. That would also be useful.
Thank you. We're now on
Can I ask one
five.
more- I'm sorry, can I ask one more quick question? On the Voya report about self-certification and attachment C, it lists committee decision points, and the last one is determine whether the city is prepared to support a technology enhancement aligned to a future release cycle. Does that mean that we would have to pay to create the ability to do this annual tracking that doesn't currently exist?
There's a cost associated, no, that would pass on to the city though.
That can be one of the points that we can clarify in the implementation.
Okay. Next item 5, committee report 26-03, 2027 annual resource review.
We'll go to bring the presentation onto the screen. If we can go ahead and start the deck. So today the committee is asked to review the assumptions that staff will be utilizing for 2027 projections of our reserve fund. So if you can go to the next slide. Just to review, our reserve fund is made up of our TPA fund that's held with Voya, along with the DCP trust fund, which is held within the city. Generally, we pay most expenses out of our TPA fund, and the trust fund is utilized to pay for travel and equipment. So certain things that we do have to go through the city accounting for. In terms of how our reserve fund is funded is generally or mostly with participant fees. So right now our participant fees are 9 basis points against your account balance with an $150 cap. and additionally interest earnings on each of the accounts. So within the account that we hold with Voya, the interest is generated as our balance is invested in the stable value fund. And with the trust fund, we get some nominal interest with the city's holdings. And so interest is allocated amongst the different departments and then allocated down to our account. For the next slide, in terms of, so first we wanted to set the picture for 2026 ending projections. So for our budgeted amounts for 2026, we had budgeted 2.9 million with total expenditures of 4.14 million. Right now, our projections for the end of the year are actually that the revenues are 2.9 million, so it's slightly more than what was budgeted for. And the expenditures are approximately 4.05 million. That also a little lower than what our budgeted expenditures were going to be. So that would result in terms of this budget year, we would have a deficit of $1.1 million that would be taken from our reserve. On the right side, we have the projected year-end balance of our fund, which is estimated to be ending 5.25 million. So with that, we are required to at least have the $2.07 million in reserve. So that would be half of the expenditures that are budgeted for 2026. So given that, we still have an additional 3.17 million in additional surplus of that. So with that projection in mind, we'll go ahead to the next slide. We're taking a look at revenues beginning in 2027 and projecting that out over the next 10 years. For 2027, we are projecting $3.865 million in revenue. So again, mostly from participant fees. And then what we do is we project out the fee over the 10 years, utilizing the assumptions related to our participant count and asset growth, and our estimated interest earnings on those both accounts. Next slide. We also took a look at the expenditures. So for 2027, we set some assumptions for what would be potentially budgeted amounts. The actual budget will be set by the board in January, but more or less this is what we would be projecting. And then applying the assumptions, we projected that out for the 10 years. Next slide, please. So with these assumptions, we now have this graph that shows year over year our projections for the next 10 years of revenue versus expenses. So this is, as you can see towards the latter end of the projection, our revenues now are matching up more so to our estimated expenses, which has been the goal of this committee over the last year or so. And we'll be talking a little bit more about that, but I did want to provide this visual so that, so we can show that we were making progress towards that. The next slide, just again, talking about our target reserve fund balance. So again, that would be our target reserve is 50% or 6 months of annual operating expenses. So for 2027, we would anticipate setting that reserve target to $2.22 million. Next slide. So trying to then align our revenues to expenses year over year and account for maintaining our reserve fund balance, we are proposing certain assumptions for 2027. So this slide here just shows you the changes from last year that we are recommending. Mainly it's adjusting the asset growth factor. So how much the planned assets will grow year over year. We're setting that to 5.5, changing that from previously we had it at 5% for 5 years and increasing to 5.5. For the enrollment adjustment factor to 2%. The personnel and city attorney cap rates 81%. So we'll go into a little bit more detail in the further slides. Additionally, you can see that for 2026, there was a fee holiday assumption 1 quarter that was assessed in 2026. And for 2027, staff at this time would not be recommending that for this year or for next year. Okay. Next slide, please. Then applying all of, yes, for the chart.
Slight lag, sorry.
Thank you. So in applying the assumptions, now we see that the reserve fund and, I'm sorry, so the blue line represents the projected balance of our fund. And the red line represents the target reserve balance that we should be holding. With all the assumptions applied, we are now, again, with this graph showing that we are approaching, that we are keeping only the amount needed in our revenue accounts. Any questions here before I go over the individual assumptions next? Next slide, please. So
Sorry.
That's
one
okay.
second.
So the first is just to talk about our administrative expenses inflation factor. We do assume just general increase of costs of 3%. So this is related to our consulting costs, our communication costs, office and admin costs. Next slide. Next assumption is related to our net enrollment growth rate. So this basically is just us trying to project how many participants the plan will be holding next year and on the 10 years throughout that. So at this time, we are recommending that the rate be set at 2%. Last year, we had set it to 1.5% for the first 5 and increasing it to 2% for the last 5 of the projection because of the city fiscal considerations that were occurring at that time. As you know, there was managed hiring practices put into place as well as layoff discussions. So we wanted to be more conservative at that time. I think that the 2026-27 fiscal outlook has improved, and additionally, we have had additional enrollments due to the fact that we have been auto-enrolling individuals from DWP. So with that, we felt comfortable to bring it back up to 2%. And next slide, as you can see, we do have some trends in terms of year-over-year growth. The last 20-year average has been 2.2% annually. The last 5-year average has been 1.6%. So the last 5 years, I think that rate represents just the fiscal issues that have occurred with the city. But in 2026, we already see that we've had a growth in the participant count. So for DWP alone, we had about 3,000 employees that were auto-enrolled and added to our participant base. So if you see at the bottom of the page, we are projecting by the end of 2026, approximately 58,000 participants in our plan. And that would be roughly 6% growth since the end of last year. So even with our assumption of the 2%, it's still potentially relatively conservative. But because this is a projection for our reserve fund, I believe trending more conservatively will still benefit us in the long run. Any questions on the enrollment growth rate?
So you think with the auto enrollment aspect of water and power, it will continue going forward to sort of boost the enrollment rate as opposed to how it was in the past?
Yeah, so not ongoing because now, so we've enrolled DWP, the bulk of their members were WPERP Tier 2, so I don't anticipate there being larger numbers. But I would imagine that after the adoption of this benefit for DWP, that it's only a matter of time that it's also adopted for the city. So at this time, I'm not able to project if that will happen, and if so, how quickly that will happen, but I would anticipate additional growth over time. And again, with the city's fiscal outlook improving this year, at least over last year, I think that, so again, the 2% may be still a little bit more conservative. But I think given the last 10-year average and the 5-year average, keeping it at 2% is still accurate in terms of applying it to our projection.
When it says net enrollment, does that mean it's net of retirees who are passing away? Or are you just using hiring?
So basically, we're just taking a look at the count at the end of the year. So anybody that might have, so we'll take a look at everybody who's open to count and anybody who's close to count. And that would include retirees. It would include people separated from service. It may also include, beneficiaries or quadro recipients that might have rolled out their funds elsewhere.
Right. Is there some future peak enrollment that you see once our large number of baby boomer retirees start passing away? Do you think there's a level at some point where that larger generation gets replaced by a smaller one and we have a peak
It's an interesting question. I don't know that I would anticipate any particular year that would change, because it would be tied to the city's fiscal outlook. So even if, say, our retirees or there are more account closures, arguably, there would still need to be the opposite action of the hiring on the city side. And so for the immediate years, I don't know that we're going to see an immediate spike in hiring that we might have in previous years. So I think that keeping it at 2% at least manages our for our assumptions the next couple of years, keeping that a little bit conservative. But again, with this employer contribution option now, that includes auto enrolling additional folks. So again, if this were to get traction on the city side, we could potentially pick up additional folks. But that would be an immediate spike. But I wouldn't bet money right now to tell you what year.
And participants passing away wouldn't necessarily close an account or deduct an account because they may have beneficiaries who stay the account with the plan.
Great point. We'll go on to the next assumption. So this is related to the plan assets growth rate, which we are proposing to set at a standard rate of 5.5%. So last year, again, just with the fiscal uncertainty, we had recommended 5% for the first 5 and then 5.5 for the latter 5 years of the projection. As you can see, the assets have continued to grow, relatively steadily, though we do see kind of flatlining in the last end of the graph here. Next slide, please. So the historical growth rates that we have reviewed. So while we can see that in the most recent years, the growth has been fairly large. I think that's attributed just to the market activity. But we did take a look on the left side here, averaging out the last 20 years of growth up to the last 5 years of growth. It's still a lot higher than our recommendation of 5%. These bottom numbers here, so the investment rate from Mercer of 6.4% leads to our, okay, let me back up. So the projected total investment contributions rate is 5.6%. So that's the rate that we would project at least for 2027. So what we did is we took a look at potential cash movements in and out of the plan based on this year's activity, projected that out for 2027, and then utilized Mercer's 6.4% rate of potential investment growth and applied that to come up with the 5.6%. So the recommendation is to use the 5.5% for the rest of the 10 years and kind of just smooth over any potential swings perhaps in participant balances. So on the right side here, we can see that there has been positive growth in the last 3 years, but in 2022, we do see that there was a dip due to the economy, the state of the economy at that time, but it generally swings back around. So again, for our projections, we are recommending the 5.5% to be applied for the 10-year projection.
How does Mercer determine the 6.4%?
Yeah, we do have Anna Atomchow here from Mercer. I think she could speak a little bit more. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, Anna Atomchow from Mercer. Yeah, so we used the portfolio's March 31, 2026 asset mix and Mercer's 20 years long-term projected assumptions to calculate that expected rate of return. And we also, we did 2 scenarios, one with the brokerage window and one without. So we came up with 6.4 and 6.5, I believe, was including the brokerage window.
These are like 20-year outlook numbers that you're looking at.
Correct.
And then, so obviously, 5.5% is lower than the 6.5% And so can you talk a little bit more, Esther or staff, about what's coming out and in the wash there that's reducing that?
Sure. So we're also taking into account the projected cash in and out of our plan. So what we do is we go back the last 12 months and take a look at cash in, so contributions, rollovers in. We also take a look at cash out, so distributions, rollovers out. And then we basically project what those numbers would look like for 2027, and then we incorporate Mercer's investment rate. And so with that, we land on the 5.6% number. So recently, our plan has been trending that the cash out has been a little bit higher than the cash in. I'm sorry, cash out is trending higher than cash in, which I believe is, with our plan being now more, half of our assets, it's basically terminated employees. So I would imagine that is just more indicative of folks taking distributions, require minimum distribution, things of that nature.
What is the term that we're trying to account for in these projections? Are we trying to account for 20 years, 5 years, 1 year? When we're putting together the assumptions on
That's
I think I've seen you use 10 years. Right?
right. So it's a mix of things. We take a look at the trend year over year over the past 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And then really we're applying Mercer's rate to what's anticipated in the next year. So we can continue to project that out over the 10 years, but we feel that is the more immediate. We need to make sure that we're able to cover that in the next coming years. So that's what's applied to the flat rate across the 10 years.
So the money's coming out for projected actually, or a bit of a drag on the growth.
Yes.
What happened? I don't think either of us were here. What happened in 2022 when you suddenly had a negative 13%? How stressed did that make the surplus or the working capital of the plan?
So I came onto the plan in 2023. I'd like to say, so I don't know directly, but I can speak to the fact that we still had enough reserve, right? There was not, because then if I had come on board and there had been an issue, I would have had to address that right away. But there was enough reserve to still address that. And one thing to do is that although there is a negative 13% growth rate, it doesn't necessarily translate directly into the fees. So that basically means that participant accounts might have seen a 10% decrease in value, but we could have still been accounting for a majority of the fees. So say somebody with we collect the fee, the maximum $115 fee on accounts over $127,000. So even though there might have been a lot of accounts above that experience that 10% decline in their asset or value of their asset, we would still have been collecting those fees. So I think that's also, year over year, we're trying to get a little bit more particular about the projections, but that I would speak to is we had enough reserve.
We were applied any sensitivity testing to the formula. In particular, when we talk about plan asset growth, maybe, and growth in the plan membership as well. Those seem to be significant variables. Have we done any of that type of work in the past?
Not to my knowledge, but that's something that we can take back to our consultants and see if we can build something that will be more indicative of that.
Yeah, not for now, but I think it could be something that's interesting to see in the future, and also to give to the chair's point, some sense as to what if things don't go well, things go really well. What are some of the downs that potentially be looking at?
Yeah, and so we'll make a note of that. But we can also at the end model different scenarios. So if there is a projected 30%, crash in the market, how does that affect our projection? So we can share that to you and see. But since we are doing this annually and plus quarterly, it's enough time where we have, opportunities to react if such a thing were to occur. But we'll definitely take that note. Thank you. And then for the stable value fund average rate of return, so this is just the assumption that we apply for the projected interest that we will be receiving on our reserve fund balance. We have indicated the rates historically for the stable value fund in the last few years, ranging from 2.74% to 3.30%. So at this time, we would just recommend that we continue with the status quo of 3%. That is conservative, again, with the projection, but given that it impacts the interest on our participant reserve fund, and as well as, we are trying to reduce down the surplus. We were just a little wary of increasing the amount for the rate of return, in that it might assume more revenue more than what we might actually be getting.
Where does our reserve fund sit again? It's not with the city, it's.
So most of it is with Voya. So yeah, so Voya.
It's earning that, the stable value fund rate.
Correct.
So,
Mhm.
okay.
And then next slide. And then another assumption that we have is related to the indirect costs rate. So we apply this to the reimbursements for staffing, so DCP team positions, as well as time reimbursed to the city attorney for our counsel and for our paralegal who handled quadro orders. On the left side here, we have the historical rates for both departments. They have not grown, as you can see, linearly, and there's some fluctuations over the years, but in the last few years have kind of steadied out. So we are providing basically the 5-year average of the past 5 years to recommend now the 81% for personnel and 81% for city attorney. Any questions related to this rate? Okay. Next slide, please. And so in terms of the participant fees, this was the proposal that was adopted last year. So it's to continue the $115 fee cap, but in 2028 to begin increasing it by $5 with a maximum cap of $135 in 2031. So that was the assumption that is applied to our projection. At this time, we don't see a need to change that projection, and that will continue to help us keep, in line with our revenue to expenditures year over year. Next slide.
We would revisit this then in advance of 2028 before we actually implement these.
Yes, yeah.
Specific determination.
Definitely. I think that next year when we come back with the annual resource recommendation again, we would have that recommendation either in hand or to tell the committee, hey, maybe we can still delay it an additional year, depending on the updated projections at that time. Next slide. So again, this is just a chart to indicate that with all of these assumptions incorporated along with that fee cap change anticipated in the future, that we would be closer to, so the blue line represents the total balance of our reserve fund. So all the dollars held with the TPA account and the dollars held with the city account. And then the orange bar indicates the reserve target that we would need to meet for each of the years. And so as we trend towards the end of the projection, we are decreasing that surplus and making sure that we are more accurate to our reserve fund target.
That includes projected fee increases.
Correct. So the earlier slide assumption, yes, we are applying that. And then next slide, please. So one thing we did at least want to provide is that since we did do a fee holiday last year, whether or not one is warranted again this year, as I know one of the committee, desires was to bring down that surplus a little quicker. Right now, if we were to implement another fee quarter in next year of 2027, so that would reduce our balance by approximately $930,000. So while it does bring our projected reserve fund balance closer to the target, you can see that in approximately year 5, we are going to be crossing into our reserve fund. So again, this is with all of our assumptions applied and assuming we are expending 100% of all of our projected expenses, which, realistically we could still come under, but it's close enough that it would not be recommended at this time. But there is some room there if the committee still wished to do that. We would just have to model out some other scenarios to make that happen. But additionally, from the fee holiday, in the first few years, we had been, making sure our expenses, we were operating at a deficit to also bring down the surplus. So that's why it's also impacting that and crossing over into the reserve fund.
Do the proposed fee cap increases eliminate the deficit, the structural deficit, or is it still at a deficit after those are applied?
Does it?
Well, just looking at page 18, this one, the higher fee cap starts to go into effect in 2028, but the surplus continues to fall after that. So why is that happening? If we've added more revenue, it looks as though it continues to be the new fees don't completely undo the deficit.
Right. So for us to meet, I guess, 2 parts of this equation. So there's the surplus, and then there's the objective to meet the level of revenue to expenditures. So for us to immediately meet that, over a year, we would then have had to increase our fee pretty steeply or conceivably. So I think the discussion was to try to stagger that in so that it's not too much of a surprise to participants. So
yes, and then when it's fully implemented in 2031, then we're flat.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think it's a great visual because it shows you that we eventually get there. It's just going to take us a little time versus because for us to immediately do that, we'd have to hike up the fee real quick.
Right. Thank you. Another question, unless you have more to do on these slides.
No.
Okay. Where did we get 50% as the right target reserve amount?
That was something that was in place long before. And so I think, do you recall offhand?
I did do a report on this last year, I believe. Initially, there were sort of arbitrary numbers associated with where it felt right for the plan to be at a target level. At some point, it was suggested that it be a function of time rather than an arbitrary number. So it was decided that 6 months of operating costs would allow for the plan to make changes or address anything if something catastrophic were to happen. I think we did vote on this last year, that to remain at 50%. But it essentially is somewhat arbitrary.
So, sorry, Stephen, I'm going
I could probably comment on it. It was that is ancient history for a board many years ago. Sure. And I can't be 100% certain that I'm recalling this, but I believe it was around the time that there had been some, major fluctuations in plan assets because we'd gone through the 2000 recession, right? And then 8 years later, there was the Great Recession. Kind of to the earlier point, there was some speculation about, okay, in a worser case kind of environment where you have a decline in plan assets that extends over multiple years, as opposed to what historically has been the case, which is really within a year or two, any downturns in plan assets were recovered and then exceeded. And I think that sort of that level of margin, which is 50% of the regular budget, felt like that would work if there was more of a longer term multi-year tension. I don't know if that's helpful or not.
The issue is that the plan wouldn't have enough money to operate. Is that?
The real concern at the time was the board did not, that board didn't want to have to raise fees. So having that large of a reserve was really intended to help them do that. So that what they didn't want to do was, when participants were seeing their account values decline, then come back and hit them with a fee increase. It just felt like it wouldn't be good optics.
Are we still happy with 50% as the amount?
I think so. That translates roughly to 6 months of
Right.
time to address the issue. So I think that is appropriate. Arguably, we could, I think last time we also had discussions about increasing the reserve potentially, but that would mean also then incorporating it into our fee considerations and adding that in. And so I don't know that that would necessarily warrant that. I would think that 6 months of lead, of railway would be sufficient, at least from our perspective. So in the future, we'll take that into consideration as well. But say we wanted to increase that to 9 months or to 12 months, then we'd have to adjust our fee model accordingly and build that into the year-over-year fee. So I think that for us, we've been operating where we've been trying to apply, a rate that is consistent for our participants. So I am aware of other programs that do change the fee that fluctuates year over year depending on the expenses. So it's a matter of, I think if we were to increase the reserve, then we might take a look at maybe year over year, making sure the fee is accurate. But I think that would cause a lot more confusion, and there's communication challenges around that too.
Thank you.
What is the timeline in which this data is being applied, and so this is to support the budget development process and plans for next year, right? So what is the timeline you work off the approvals and applying this information to go forward?
So the reason that we have this discussion in the summertime here is to make sure that if there are any budget requests that we need to submit to the city. So, a few years back, we had some budget or some position requests. So if that was something that was going to be approved by committee or board, that would have needed to have gone through the personnel department by about October or November. So that gives us enough time generally to provide that documentation and get them board approvals. So this year with more so this is just applied internally for our purposes. So in January, we would apply it to any considerations for 2027. So in January, we will set the budget for 2027 expenditures and projected revenue. And then during the year quarterly, as we're providing board updates on the reserve fund, those assumptions would be applied at that time. And so we continually look at the health of the reserve fund, and we try to project it out to 10 years, just on a move forward basis.
No, I think I'm just, like I indicated, going forward, interested in potential of looking at some sensitivity analysis, maybe a little bit more information as well around the net inflows and how that factors into the overall growth projection. But yeah, nothing that would sort of change my thoughts about the current, which is that you do seem to be appropriate assumptions, generally.
Right. In that case, I'll move to adopt the staff recommendation to recommend to the board that they adopt the assumptions in the report. We don't have any changes. So as to Part B, not necessary. And then we would ask the sensitivity type thing, maybe that could be brought to the board rather than to you.
Or in the future, yeah, I'm not sure what might be entailed in that, but I'm certainly happy to talk more about it as well.
Okay, so is there a second to my motion?
Second.
All right, all in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed? The ayes have it. And we'll move to the next item. 6, requests for future agenda items. Do any members of the board have any request? Sorry, of the committee have a request for future agenda items? Okay, next is our next meeting date. That is to be determined in cooperation with the staff and the members. And so on that, I think we're ready to adjourn. The time is 1:50. We are adjourned.
Thank you.